Hello everyone, and today I'm going to be doing a deck tech for Falco Spara, the Pact Weaver. Falco Spara is a 3/3 flying trample. When he enters, you put a shield counter on him. You may look at the top card of your library at any time, and you may cast spells from the top of your library by removing a counter from a creature you control in addition to paying its other costs. So this deck is bank counter value. So the general game plan is that the deck doesn't need Falco to function. He's just there as a value engine. He's there for card advantage. The main plan is to get a bunch of counters on our creatures that are just going to be 1/1 counters, and to beat down our opponents with our large creatures. The reason we use Falco is because he's giving us extra cards to play with, and the cost of removing a counter is basically nothing when it's really just drawing us a card. And we run a lot of creatures that give counters every turn to ensure that we can consistently have the counters to remove to cast the top card of our deck. So let's get into it. So Planeswalkers, I'd like to start with first and why we're going to be using them. Ajani, Mentor of Heroes, +1 them, distribute 3 1/1 counters among 1, 2, or 3 target creatures you control. And then you can also just +1 them again to dig 4 cards in your deck to get a creature or Planeswalker. Probably a creature if you really need it, but we're really running him for the counter thing because he will just like enable Falco himself if need be. Next, we have Basri. Basri is just good in general. He's a 3 and he puts a 1/1 counter on a target creature we control, and it just gets indestructible, so it's kind of like a free attack. Elspeth, one of the new ones from Capenna. And again, there's going to be a lot of Capenna cards in this video because the commander is from Capenna. So I'm interested to see how these work out, but in theory, we're using Elspeth Resplendent, 5 mana, which is kind of a little bit. But we choose up to 1 target creature, put a 1/1 counter on that creature, and a counter from Flying, First Strike, Lifelink, or Vigilance. So not only can we remove a 1/1 counter if we need to for Falco, but we can also remove a Flying counter, a First Strike counter, a Lifelink, or a Vigilance counter, whatever. Falco doesn't specify what counter you get rid of, as long as it is a counter. And throughout the video, the whole point of the deck is to beat down with our big creatures. It's not all about removing counters, but Falco is just a good engine to make it happen. And then Elspeth, look at the top 7 cards of your deck. You may reveal a permanent with mana cost 3 or less, put it on the battlefield with a shield counter on it. That's like another little way, but we typically don't want to make a gamble with that. And if we can get 5 angels, cool. Planeswalkers. Nessa voices Zendikar. So the reason I like her is because her -2 says put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. That's just really good. Again, we're basically a go wide, beat down with big creatures deck. And Nissa, I mean, we're not really going to care about her ult too much. Her +1 is kind of relevant because it makes like a good blocker. It makes like a good target, like, you know, if you want to put counters on something. But nonetheless, Vivian, Monster's Advocate. Look at the top card of your library at any time, and you can cast creatures from the top card. So it's just like a little alternate way if we don't want to use Falco and there's a creature on top. Create a 3/3 green beast creature token. Put your choice of a vigilance counter, a reach counter, or a trample counter on it. Again, these are counters that we can remove to Falco if we want to play the top card, assuming it isn't a creature with Vivian. And then Vivian's just good because we -2 her, and it just kind of gives our next creature spell a 2-for-1. Now going into our creatures. Basri's Lieutenant. So we're primarily a 1/1 counter deck, right? Basri says whenever he or another creature you control dies, if it had a 1/1 counter on it, make a 2/2 white knight creature token with vigilance. It's basically just kind of protection for our creatures. Like if they do die, Basri lets it replace themselves. And also like Basri comes in, he comes in with a counter, or he puts a counter on some things, but he's basically a 4/5 with vigilance and pro multicolor. He's pretty good. Champion of Lamphold. Creatures with power less than Champion of Lamphold's power can't block creatures you control. That's a really big deal because whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you put a 1/1 counter on Champion of Lamphold. So there's like a lot of these ways that we can amass a lot of counters on our creatures. So really removing counters isn't really a big, it's never like an issue we're going to run into. But Champion of Lamphold gets huge by herself, right? Just from us playing the game, and then she basically makes our stuff unblockable. She's very good. Chasm Skulker. Whenever you draw a card, put a 1/1 counter on it. We're in Bant, so we're probably going to draw pretty well. And then when he does die, we just make a ton of 1/1 blue squids with Highland Walk for the number of 1/1 counters on him. He's just good. Like, he's a great way to put 1/1 counters on himself, or he's like a big guy at least. And then if he does die, which isn't even bad because we're basically going to get a lot of pseudo-unblockable dudes. Conclave Mentor. 2/2, if one or more counters will be put on a creature you control, put that many counters on it +1 on the creature. And then, like, if he dies, you gain life equal to its power. So really, if you're going to put a 1/1 counter on a creature, you really put 2 1/1 counters. If you're going to put 2 1/1 counters, you really put 3 1/1 counters. He's just good. He just doubles up our counters. And then, since he's probably going to be big himself, and he dies, then we're just going to gain a lot of life. It's no big deal. Crystalline Giant. He's a nightmare. I don't know if you guys have ever played with Crystalline Giant in Paper Magic, but it sucks. But he's incredibly good because he is a 3/3 for 3 mana, and he says at the beginning of combat on your turn, choose a kind of counter at random that he doesn't have. This is why he's a nightmare. And you pick from Flying First Strike, Death Touch, Hexproof. Wait. Flying First Strike, Death Touch, Hexproof, Lifelink, Menace, Reach, Trample, Vigilance, and a 1/1 counter. Put a counter of that kind on Crystalline Giant. So again, he's one of those ways that we put a 1/1 counter, like we're going to get like a bunch of 1/1 counters or a kind of counter every turn. He just becomes keyword soup himself. But if we need to remove counters, like he produces a counter every turn if we want to use Falco. Devoted Druid was a highly speculated card when Falco was released because you put a -1/-1 counter on Devoted Druid, you untap Devoted Druid, and then you can tap it again for a green. So basically, Devoted Druid is nice because we can tap Devoted Druid to put a -1/-1 counter on it, right? And then we can remove, like, we'll have a mana. Then we can tap him again, right? So 2 mana. And then we can use that 2 mana and remove the -1/-1 counter, essentially to cast spells with Falco for cheaper. So he just helps. And then, like, if he does get big, since we're putting a lot of 1/1 counters, negative or -1/-1 counters and 1/1 counters cancel each other out, so you can do a lot of tapping and untapping with Devoted Druid in counter decks. Fathom Mage. 4 mana 1/1, which is a bad rate. Evolve, really weird keyword, but basically if a creature enters the battlefield and it's stronger than Fathom Mage, you put a 1/1 counter on Fathom Mage. But whenever a 1/1 counter is placed on Fathom Mage, you may draw a card. Again, we put a lot of 1/1 counters on our creatures. Fathom Mage is just a great way for us to draw cards. Flux Channeler. 3 mana, 2/2. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, proliferate. We have 37 non-creature spells in this deck. So, more often than not, we're going to proliferate with Flux Channeler and make our team even bigger. Forgotten Ancient is a really good card in the deck. A 0/3 sucks, but for 4 mana, and whenever a player casts a spell, not just us, you may put a 1/1 counter on them. And then at the beginning of your upkeep, you may move any number of 1/1 counters from Forgotten Ancient onto other creatures. Forgotten Ancient is like the ideal way to use Falco Spara, in my opinion. The ideal way to remove counters is by using a creature like Forgotten Ancient who gets a ton of counters by himself every turn. Not even your turn, every turn, because people have to play spells. And then he can just move him over to someone else. Whew, even better. Glen Elendra Archmage. Flying 2/2, sacrifice Glen Elendra, counter target non-creature spell, and it has persist. So, Glen Elendra is annoying, but she's good because we basically pay a mana, we kill her, and we negate something. But then it has persist. So when it dies, it comes back with a -1/-1 counter. Well, we can remove that -1/-1 counter to Falco Spara to cast the top card of our deck, and then, again, have another negate. Like, infinite negates, basically. I want to say now, because I also had this confusion at the beginning, Falco Spara cannot just remove counters for nothing. That would be insane. Whenever you remove a counter, it must be to cast the top card of your library. So it's not just like really infinite, but again, if we just like want to cast a spell, we'll just remove a counter from this and then we'll have another counter spell. Anyways, Good Fortune Unicorn. It's just a good card. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you put a 1/1 counter on that creature. We're a 1/1 counter deck, and now all our creatures enter with a counter. It's really, really good. Hazma Guardian of Erishin. 6 mana is chunky for a 5/5. but he costs 1 less for each creature you control with a 1/1 counter. So really, it's going to be a 2 mana 5/5. And then creature spells cost 1 less to cast for each creature you control with a 1/1 counter. So, he's just a big boy, and he's a big cost reducer. And again, we want to play as many cards from our deck with Falcon Spara as much as we can. Like, we are a beatdown deck, but the idea that makes Falco so good is that he basically will always outvalue your opponents. And that'll like flood us into annoying board states. So having Hamza be a little cost reducer is very good. Hopeful Initiate, I like a lot. It's a new card from Crimson Vow, which I don't really like a lot, but that's another video. 1 mana, 1/2, with training, not really super relevant. What's relevant is paying 3 mana, remove 2 1/1 counters from among creatures you control, not just the Initiate, creatures you control, and you pop an artifact or enchantment at instant speed. It's just good. You know, again, 1 mana, or the way we're looking at Falco Spara is remove a counter, draw a card. Basically, that's kind of what he reads. This is just remove 2 counters, paste it like 3 mana, and destroy a target artifact or enchantment. Maybe it's not a fair evaluation of it, but that's kind of how I read it. Just having that kind of like on the board makes it problematic for a lot of decks. Juniper Order Ranger. 5 mana, 2/4. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you put a 1/1 counter on that creature, and you put a 1/1 counter on Juniper Order Ranger. He's quite literally just Good Fortune Unicorn, but he also gets a 1/1 counter. He's a little bit more expensive for a little bit bigger of a boy. But yeah, we want to have 1/1 counters on all our creatures, and we want to be able to beat down with them effectively. Kodama of the West Tree, from Kamigawa, which conversely to Vow, I do like a lot. 3 mana, 3/3 with reach is a great rate. Modified creatures you control have trample, which is basically going to be our creatures have trample. And then whenever a modified creature you control deals combat damage to a player, search your library for a basic land card and put that card onto the battlefield tapped. He's just really, really good ramp. He's really, really good deck thinning. All of our creatures are typically going to have 1/1 counters on them anyways, and we want to beat down anyways. And he gives trample, and he rewards for combat. He's like literally insane. He's so good. Leonor, Autumn Sovereign. 4 mana for a 0/4. However, at the beginning of combat on your turn, put a 1/1 counter on up to 1 target creature you control. Then if you control 3 or more creatures with different powers, you draw a card. So again, a little bit more draw support, kind of conversely to Falco. The reason I like Leonor is because Falco Spara cannot play lands from the top of your deck, because he doesn't say you play the card, he says you cast the card, which can get problematic. So if we're going out and we're comboing off and we're doing all this, and then there is a land on top of our deck, we can't really do much about it. Like, we can't cast it, we can't get rid of it. There's a few cards in the deck to make sure it doesn't happen. Like, we have Kodama, who thins a little bit, but Leonor being able to draw the top card is good, and it gives us another chance to continue going through. And she's just like, you know, put a 1/1 counter. She enables Falco herself. She's very good. And she's like a big body anyways. Lion Sash. He's just, you know, Lion Sash is basically the new Scavenging Ooze, in my opinion. I think it's better than Scavenging Ooze. It's 2 mana for a 1/1 for an equipment cat. Exile target card from a graveyard. If it was a permanent card, put a 1/1 counter on Lion Sash. Equip creature gets +1/+1 for each 1/1 counter on Lion Sash. And you can equip Lion Sash so you can make the creature even bigger. It's just kind of our way. We don't have much grave hate, but we're going to have a little bit of targeted grave hate with Lion Sash. Luminark Aspirant. It's just at the beginning of combat on your turn, put a 1/1 counter on target creature you control. Luminark Aspirant is just baby version of Leonor. That's really it. Just a little baby version. Luminous Broodmoth. A little fun card with this deck. 3/4 for 4 mana flying. When a creature you control without flying dies, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control with a flying counter. Now the funny thing is we can remove these flying counters with Falco when we cast spells. So we can do a big stupid block, have that creature die, it'll come back with a flying counter, and then on our turn, we can just, you know, remove that flying counter and make it rinse and repeat. Mana Gorger Hydra. I love this card. 3 mana 1/1. It's basically Forgotten Ancient. Whenever a player casts a spell, put a 1/1 counter on Mana Gorger Hydra. And it has trample. Big beater. And I mean, you know, players are casting spells constantly. Not just us. Again, it's player. So we can use these 1/1 counters to just, like, pay Falco Spara's cost. And I know for every creature I see that puts a 1/1 counter on something, or any kind of counter, or involves a counter in general, I say it works with Falco Spara. It's just because Falco is just such a good engine that everything works. So, like, everything basically synergizes with Falco. Master Biomancer, very good card, 2/4 for 4 mana. Each other creature you control enters the battlefield with a number of additional 1/1 counters on it equal to Master Biomancer's power and is a mutant addition to its other types. Doesn't matter if it's a mutant. The fact is, base value, our creatures are entering with 2 1/1 counters. When Master Biomancer gets bigger and becomes like a 10/10, now all of our other creatures are entering with 10 1/1 counters on it. He's very good for beatdown. Mage's the Lunark. 0/0, white and an X. We just basically dump whatever mana we want to as we can. Enter for that many 1/1 counters, which is very good. You can tap them to put a 1/1 counter on them, or you can tap them, remove a 1/1 counter, and put a 1/1 counter on your entire team. Very good, whichever you want to do. Probably since we have so many cards that say put a 1/1 counter on a creature, just dump it on him, tap him, beef up the whole team. Oracle Boldiah, you're probably thinking, why would you put that in this deck? Doesn't really make sense. And like I said with Leonor about the draw, we cannot play lands with Falco Spara. So, yeah, we play with the top card of our library revealed. Doesn't matter. But we can play lands from the top card of our library. And not only that, but we can play an additional land on each of our turns. So, if there's a land on top, we can play it. Worst case, there's worst case, there's another land. We're stuck, you know? Lands being on top kind of halts us a little bit, which is why it's rough. But Oracle Moldiah really helps with that. We can play 2 lands, we can check out the top card of our deck, and we can deal with it. If it's a land, we play it, we ramp more, and we can do more with Falco then. Pure Imaginative Rascal, he partners with Toothy, we'll see him in a second. If one or more counters will be placed on a permanent your team controls, that many counters plus 1 of each of those kinds are added instead. So, he's very good because a lot of the cards we have seen so far that have said, like, oh, like, whenever a creature enters the battlefield, put another 1/1 counter on it. Pier is good because he says whenever any counter would be placed on a creature or a permanent you control, it gets an additional counter. So he works with shield counters, he works with planeswalkers, he works with 1/1 counter, he works with every counter, he just basically adds a little bit more, which is why he's very good. And he also thins out and gets another card from our deck. Schlei, Voice of Plenty. 4 mana, 3/4, flying. You and planeswalkers you control, and other creatures you control, have hexproof. That by itself is pretty nutty. Then, it's 6 mana to put a 1/1 counter on each creature you control, add instant speed. Schlei's incredibly good. She's just like nuts. Even just base value, a flying 3/4 for 4 mana is just good. I mean, it's not fantastic, but it's good, right? And then giving you and your entire team, like, hexproof is also good. And then having a combat trick stapled on her, or just like end of turn value, oh, she's crazy. Sunscorch Regent, 5 mana 4/3. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, you put a 1/1 counter on Sunscorch Regent and you gain a life. He's a little bit different to Forgotten Ancient and Mana Gorger Hydra. The life isn't super relevant, but again, we don't know yet. If maybe we're in a tough spot. Either way, it's just a way we can sync counters, and it's a big beater. Going back to Pier and Toothy, we have Toothy, who has a lot of teeth, believe it or not. Whenever you draw a card, put a 1/1 counter on Toothy, the Imaginative Friend, just like Chasm Skulker. And then when Toothy leaves the battlefield, not dies or is exiled or is bounced, it just leaves, which is really good. Draw a card for each 1/1 counter on him. Again, we're not really a top of the deck matters deck. Falco's there for value, and I know I'm really painting it like we care about what's on top of our deck. We do because we get to play it. But having all these extra cards, we just ultimately want to outvalue our opponent by essentially drawing. And that's what Falco does, and that's what Toothy does when he becomes very large. Vega the Watcher. There's a little meme I saw I kind of liked. 3 mana 2/2 flying. Whenever you cast a spell from anywhere other than your hand, draw a card. So whenever you cast a spell from the top card of your deck, draw a card. It's pretty good. You know, we're basically 2 for 1ing everything now. But that's it for creatures. Sorceries, cultivate, you know, just get 2 lands. It's good. Damning Verdict, very good. Haven't seen it be played yet because, again, it is so new. Destroy all creatures with no counters on them. Ideally, our entire team always has counters on it, so it's kind of a one-sided nuke. And then Kodama's is just cultivate slightly better because it's arcane, and you can splice onto it. But, you know, just get 2 land, help color fix, help ramp, because, you know, we want to have a lot of land and mana to be able to keep casting the spells we get. Oversimplify, 5 mana, exile all creatures. Each player creates a 0/0 green and blue fractal creature token and puts a number of 1/1 counters on it, equal to the total power of creatures they controlled that were exiled this way. It's just in Simic, like an exile nuke before Strixhaven was like unheard of. So this is a mass exile spell in blue and green for creatures. And like, I don't care if like my opponents get like a 100/100. Like, as long as I can block it, and as long as their big scary threats are, I take that back. I actually would care if my opponents had a 100/100. I would hate that, actually. But again, like, you get my point. Like, you wipe the board. It's the same kind of logic as Beast Within, is you get rid of something problematic, and then they get, like, an elephant. Again, you get rid of their problematic field, and now they get a big field. But the effects are gone, at least. Supreme Verdict, it's a nuke, and it can't be countered. That's it. We have shield counters to help some of our things, but again, it's just Supreme Verdict. It's a good nuke. Tezzeret's Gambit. It's 3 mana and it costs 2 life because no one ever pays for Phyrexian unless you really, really have to. Draw 2 cards and proliferate. Draw 2 cards is good because we want to be able to outvalue. Then proliferate is even better because we want to have a big board. 3 visits, search your library for a forest card and put that card on the battlefield. What's good about 3 visits is it doesn't say a basic forest. So you'll see later when we get to the land section that we have the Triome, we have Shocklands, we have, you know, regular basic forest. And it also doesn't put it into play tapped. So you can, in theory, grab a Shockland and play it untapped with 3 visits, which is just good. Instance, Akroma's Will. It's potentially, you know, a game-winning card. 4 mana, choose 1, and we're probably always going to have Falco. I know I keep saying we don't need Falco, but he's just good to have, you know? Creatures you control gain flying, vigilance, and double strike until end of turn if we want to beat down. If someone nukes or someone does a big swing against us, creatures you control gain lifelink, indestructible, and protection from all colors until end of turn. Or we can do the Sunday special, mash them both together, and ideally kill someone. That's really it. Because protection from all colors, unless we're going against like Eldrazi or Artifact Creature Tribal, they're going to be unblockable. Cyclonic Rift, it's Cyclonic Rift. It's a 7 mana one-sided board wipe at instant speed. That's really all it is. Generous Gift, get rid of a permanent we don't like, and then they get an elephant. That's really it. You know, you get rid of a problematic permanent, and being a permanent is good because it'll hit lands, it'll hit enchantments, artifacts, planeswalkers, what have you. You get rid of something you don't like right then and there, and more often than not, whatever you're getting rid of is going to be much worse than a 3/3 elephant that they get in return. Heroic Intervention. So, just like Akroma's Will, it is something to say that our board can be fragile. It really can. We're not really running any counterspells. Not really running any counterspells. We aren't running any counterspells. We're just not, which is kind of silly in Bant, but we're just not doing it. So when someone does try to nuke or do anything like that, we have Heroic Intervention, which will make our permanents hexproof and indestructible until the turn. We'll have Inspiring Call, which will let us draw a bunch of cards and then give our creatures with 1/1 counters, which is basically all of them, indestructible till the turn. And then kind of on the other end, we have Silk Guard. Silk Guard says 1 and X, put a 1/1 counter on up to X target creatures you control, and then auras, equipment, and modified creatures you control gain hexproof. So Silk Guard is good. If someone tries to blow up one of our things, we basically just pay like 2 mana, and we can give something, or even just 1 mana if it already, or just a green, pay X is 0. If it already has a counter on it, and then we can just do like a little snakeskin veil or whatever. Or we can like just really dump out and just say, yup, our entire team has like a 1/1 counter, depending how many creatures we target. Again, it's just good to have hexproof. It's a good combat trick because it's your entire team gets +1/+1. But again, it's still new, and I'm testing it out because in theory I think it's good, but we have to see how it goes in practice. And then we have Swords to Plowshares as the final instant. It's Swords to Plowshares. You get rid of a creature, they gain life. It doesn't really matter that they gain life. Just a 1 mana removal spell is insane, and Swords to Plowshares has proven itself over and over again. Artifacts, we're not really having anything crazy. We have Arcane Signet, Azorius Signet, and Selesnya Signet. They're just kind of there for a little bit of mana ramp. We're running slightly less lands because if we get like one of these signets on top, we can cast that instead if there's a land. So we're like basically like net losing 1 mana at the end of it to have more mana next turn. And then we have Simic Signet for the same reason, Soul Ring, because it's Soul Ring, it's just good. And then Great Henge is never going to cost that much. With how big our creatures are going to be, it's basically going to be a lot less than 9. It'll realistically probably just be potentially even 2, but maybe 4. It's not going to be that big. You can tap it, it's a mana rock, get some green and 2 life, but then whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield, you put a 1/1 counter on it and draw a card, which both are relevant and both are what we want to do in the deck, is card advantage and 1/1 counters. Finally, we have the Ozolith. The Ozolith is like made for this kind of deck. Whenever a creature you control leaves the battlefield, if it had counters on it, put those counters on the Ozolith. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if the Ozolith has counters on it, you may move all counters from the Ozolith onto target creature. So the thing that's very nice about this card is if someone does nuke or someone does kill our creatures, normally before this we would just lose everything. We would lose all our counters. But the Ozolith, for 1 mana, which is insane, prevents that from happening. And it's not just 1/1 counters, it's all counters. Shield counters, vigilance, trample, flying, whatever kind of counter you can think of, Ozolith will protect against it. So Ozolith, we don't lose all the resources and all the time and energy we spent beefing up our team or our creatures because the Ozolith is basically an insurance policy. Let's go to enchantments. Branching Evolution, it's basically the one side of doubling season that cares about counters. If we would put 1 more 1/1 counters on a creature you control, put twice that many 1/1 counters on that creature instead. The reason, and I'll tell you now, I don't have doubling season in this deck, is just because it's too expensive. And I know the Great Henge is expensive too. I wanted this deck to be pseudo budget, but you could always add things to make it crazier. This is kind of like, I want it to be like a casual to like, not competitive by any means, but like a stronger casual deck. And when you add too many cards like Doubling Season and all like the big fancy things, it starts to muddle the mixtures, and not everyone's always into that. So Branching Evolution for the fair half of it. Broker's Ascendancy. New card from Capenna, just costs ban, enchantment. At the beginning of your end step, put a 1/1 counter on each creature you control and a loyalty counter on each planeswalker we control. We're not really running it for the loyalty counter, it's a little added bonus, but beefing up our team at the beginning of our end step is very good, especially when it means that we will be able to block better off later. Cathar's Crusade, whenever a creature you control enters the battlefield under your control... Mess that up. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a 1/1 counter on each creature you control, which includes that creature. Which is incredibly good because, again, we want our team to be constantly beefed. We want our team to have counters. It's good for Falco to remove counters when they're being added all the time. Cathar's Crusades is very good. Family's Favor. New card in Capenna, and I know I've been saying that a lot, but this one's actually very interesting to me. Whenever you attack, put a shield counter on the attacking or target attacking creature. Until the end of turn, it gains, when this creature deals combat damage to a player, remove a shield counter from it. If you do, draw a card. So here's why it's interesting. So we're either getting, we're attacking, right, with our biggest guy. Worst case scenario, they just chump block, whatever, we still kill a creature. They either take the damage, right, and then we remove a counter and we draw a card, or they take the damage and we just have a shield counter on it, and it's basically giving our creature indestructible end of turn. And then another thing to think about is with Falco, if we have a land on top post-combat, or during combat, we can always try and draw that card for basically no cost at our urn, basically just says we have to tap a creature. and try and get that land to continue the cycle. So Family's Favor is very interesting to me. I really want to see how it goes, but in theory, again, I think it's good. Felidar Retreat, 4 mana, landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, choose one of them. You make a 2/2 cat, or you put a 1/1 counter on each creature you control. Those creatures gain vigilance. We have about 36 lands in the deck, I believe, off the top of my head. So we're making a 2/2. We can put counters on that. It'll get stronger later. Or we can beef up the entire team. And again, we're getting all this just from playing a land. It's a very good card. Hardened Scales, it's an old classic from Khans. 1 mana, which is a great rate. If one or more 1/1 counters will be placed on a creature you control, that many +1 of those 1/1 counters are placed instead. It just adds an extra counter for 1 mana. It's very good. Mirari's Wake. Creatures you control get +1/+1. Whenever you tap a land for mana, add 1 mana. Basically, your lands are doubled. The reason I like Mirari's Wake is 1, we're in the colors for it, it's good. 2, it buffs up all our creatures, not with counters, but just a lord effect. But also, since our lands are now tapping for double, we can go even further with how many spells we can cast every turn from the top of our deck with Falco, or the ones in our hand, which I like a lot. Resourceful Defense, new card from Capenna Commander. I like it. It's basically the ozolith. Whenever a permanent you control leaves the battlefield, if it had counters on it, put those counters on target permanent you control, and then you can always swap around the amount of permanents and counters. So it'll be fun for shenanigans. Like Planeswalkers, for example. It's like, oh, I'm going to move all my loyalty counters from one Planeswalker to another, and I'm going to ult it. Or you have like, oh, my creature died, and it's basically the ozolith. Or I'm going to put all my 1/1 counters on like Fathom Mage and draw a ton of cards. And getting into the next one, Simic Ascendancy, I'm going to put all, like, I'm going to do all this nonsense with Simic Ascendancy and all that kind of counters being added and whatever. Simic Ascendancy, 2 mana, put a 1/1 counter on target creature you control for 3 mana. Whenever 1 or more 1/1 counters are placed on a creature you control, put a growth counter on Simic Ascendancy. And then at the beginning of your upkeep, if it has 20 or more growth counters on it, we win the game. It's not our goal. I just like it because it's like a scary threat for people in a 1/1 counter deck. And also, it's good for just being like 3 mana, put a 1/1 counter on target creature you control at instant speed. It's like a good mana sink at the end of the day. And if it wins us the game, neat. And it's also like 2 mana if things do go wrong. Soothsaying, really ignore the shuffle your library. We're not going to be doing that too much. But what we are going to be doing is looking at the top X cards of our library and putting them back in any order. So if we have some spare mana or we really need a solution, we can pay a little bit of mana, remove a counter, and then cast it with Falco. Things like that. Which is very good. You can always shuffle your deck if you really need to, but more often than not, I think we'll be okay. Let's get into lands. We're running Simple Cycle, so we'll do lands pretty quick. Bountiful Promenade, Breeding Pool, we are running the Shock lands, we are running the Battle Bond lands. Command Tower is basically just an untapped land that taps for 3 colors, which is very good. Deserted Beach, Dreamroot, Cascade, they're kind of just more fast. They're not fast lands, but again, just duels that are most likely coming in untapped are very good. Exotic Orchard is just an untapped duel, an untapped triome, an untapped whatever. More often than not, Exotic Orchard is tapping for more than 1 color, no matter what. Fabled Passage, at this point, just don't really run Evolving Wilds or Terramorphic Expanse. Fabled Passage used to be expensive, but it's cheap enough to the point where that's really all it is. Glacial Fortress, it's a check land. Hollowed Fountain, it's a shock land. We're running the shocks, we're running the checks. We're running the fast lands. Again, like I said, Hinterland Harbor is a check land. Overgrown Farmland is a fast land. I know they're not fast lands. I know the fast lands are like when you control like 2 or fewer, but I don't know what these ones are called, so I'm calling them fast lands, and I know I'm wrong. Rejuvenating Springs are the Battle Bond lands. We're always going to have more than 2 opponents because this deck was made with the envisionment of playing in a pod of 4 people, including yourself. Sea of Clouds is a Battle Bond land. Seaside Citadel just comes in tapped, and it taps for all of our colors. And then we have Spara's Headquarters, which is just a strict upgrade from Seaside Citadel. We can cycle it. We can get it with 3 visits. It enters tapped. It taps for all of our colors. It's incredibly, incredibly good. Plus, it has our commander's name in it, which is a little fun keepsake or namesake. Sun Petal Grove is another check. Temple Garden, Shockland, and Temple of Enlightenment, not like Temple Garden. It's the other temple cycle. When it enters the battlefield, we scry one, which is good because we're going to be playing the top card of our deck with Falco. So if it's like a land on top, we can always tuck it away. And then we have the other two temples to finish it off. We are running basics, believe it or not. We're running 5 plains, 4 islands, and 6 basics. It just kind of worked out that it was like 40% of the deck or so was green. It's like 30 something percent was plains, and then like a high 20% was like islands. So this is our general thing, but with our duels, it should be good. Just miscellaneous info. Deck costs about $450, which is, I guess, kind of, it's not budget, but it's also not like crazy expensive. And then you can always, trim some cards away, like run like different lands. I know like the Great Henge is like a $70 card. Like the deck can do without some, but again, it's fine. The average CMC without lands is 3.2. The average CMC with lands is 2. So again, that is basically saying that all of our spells are generally going to cost around 3 mana or so on average. Thank you guys for watching. Please subscribe to my channel, like the video, and comment the video. And let me know what decks you guys want me to do next. I just like doing them. I did this one because personally I'm going to be making this deck. So thank you guys for watching. Remember to subscribe and do all that, and I will see you guys next time.